Hi everybody, welcome back to the Panda Props and Costumes channel. Today we are going to weather a blaster. This is something I've actually wanted to do for a long time but hadn't got a chance to get to this particular project. So we've got a great opportunity. We've got someone coming in today who brought in their blaster and we're going to try and weather it, add a little bit of detail. So one of the things that we're going to talk about, of course, is how to weather it and all the different types of paints. And then we're also going to add a little bit of detail. So this is a really nice blaster. I think it's made by Quest Industries or something like that. And they're in Canada. And I think you can find them on Etsy and that sort of thing. But, you know, really nice, detailed. This is the E-11 Stormtrooper blaster. So one of the cool features is that this rear cap here actually twists and comes off. And you can see it's got a hollow end, and this is kind of normally where the cocking lever would go, and you'd see a big giant spring inside. And so we are going to try and make a spring for that, or at least something that looks like a spring. So hopefully what you see right now is a really cool time lapse, and we'll get right to it.
Okay, so what we're going to try and do is replicate the spring that goes inside the E-11. On the original prop, it was a Sterling submachine gun, and it had a spring with a couple of internal parts inside. This is just a resin plastic prop, and the inner diameter, the hole that goes down the receiver, is actually not even the original size. It's a bit smaller. So I'm using a 1/2-inch wood dowel, and I'm wrapping some aluminum armature wire around it. Just using a pair of pliers to hold it down. And then I'm going to snip the ends, and then what I'm going to do is remove the coil and then stretch it out to simulate the spring. And this blaster is really nice, is that it's got a end cap that will actually, the spring will actually help keep it in place by adding a bit of tension to it. So you can see here I'm just snipping the ends of the coils off, and then I'm going to stretch it out and put it inside, and it fits pretty much perfect. So it does the job in terms of adding a little bit more detail to the blaster, so that when you look in that gap, it's just not a big empty space.
Awesome, so there we go. We've wound our aluminum wire around this wooden dowel and stretched it out, and it fit perfectly in this opening here. So I think the wood dowel is about 1/2 inch in diameter, and I used some aluminum wire, some sculpting armature wire is what it's called. But there you go. Now you've got a cool looking spring. So let's get to adding some detail with some weathering. All right, so let's talk about weathering. How I normally weather prop blasters and weapons and that kind of thing. You know, a lot of times when you see them on screen, they look black, they look weathered, and this one in particular is already painted or black. I actually don't paint blasters black because it's kind of an old, art direction trick from my days in illustration and game development and that kind of thing. Whenever you actually paint something black or white and you use it in video or you use it in games or anything like that, it basically looks like a detailless blob on screen. A lot of times things are further away, they're not held up close, and so it's all about sort of tone and color levels and balance, right, and contrast that you see in film. So people that have worked in film and that sort of thing, you generally try not to wear pure white clothes because if there's lighting or if there's sun, it'll blow out, it'll overexpose, and then you don't get any detail. So if you look at the original trilogy, Stormtroopers and Star Wars, they actually weren't pure white. They were sort of like an off-white, cream off-white color, that sort of thing. Or if you look at Darth Vader's helmet in A New Hope, he actually had different sections of the helmet painted with silver highlights to make it look like it was reflecting light and add a little bit more dimension to it. So in most cases for blasters, I'll actually paint it a gunmetal color, sort of more like a metallic or a darker gray. And then that way when you weather it with black, the black will actually go into the recesses and it'll make it look like there's a little bit more dirt on it. For this particular blaster and this particular customer, they don't necessarily want to paint it again. They just want to add some light weathering to it. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to leave it the way it is. It's not going to have quite the same punch as a fully painted blaster, but it's going to be okay. I think it's going to still look pretty good. Sometimes I'll use different materials to weather depending on what the finished product is. This is sort of like a resin and plastic cast blaster. You can use tons of different things on it. It also depends on how much time you have. So a really, really quick way to weather something is take an old sock. So there's an old sock with a hole in it. And what you do is you put the sock on, and you actually take your silver spray paint. You can use kind of any lacquer-based spray paint. Doesn't really matter what type. And what you're going to do is you're going to spray the paint on the sock. I'm just going to do a little bit here just so you can see. All right. And then what you do is you gently pat it on the high spots of your blaster. And that's going to give you a really quick, sort of kind of instant weathering to it. Now, the trick with this is, of course you can break out paintbrushes and Q-tips and this sort of thing and go wild with adding detail everywhere. This is a very, very fast way of doing it. And I will actually use this, and I'll explain a little bit later why. But I generally don't do this all over because it has a very, look, I have a black blaster with silver spots on it, and that's actually not the way I want it to look. I want it to look a little bit more weathered and grungy than that. So by just using this technique, it's a little bit kind of one-dimensional. But I am going to use this technique at the very, very end because any kind of lacquer-based spray paint is going to be a lot more opaque, and it's going to be a lot more solid in terms of the silver detail than acrylics or other types of finishes. So I'll actually use that as the very, very last type of highlighting that's going to go on. So Mr. Sock is going to come back later. I forgot to add you should probably wear gloves underneath when you're doing this, but that was just for a little demo. The other two types of products that I'll sometimes use is Rub and Buff. And Rub and Buff is a wax-based finish, and what you can do is you can use your finger or a little piece of cloth or whatever, and you can rub it like a wax. It's a very, very light sort of paste. And what it does is it just kind of puts a nice little coating on as a highlight. It's not very durable. It does sort of wear and eventually come off. You can get them in different kind of metallic colors. But you can see here just in the picture, it's like someone's using it to weather a picture frame to make it look kind of antique, right? But very, very similar techniques. They're using a darker colored paint for the frame itself, and then they're using this as kind of the highlight color. So I know a lot of different prop makers will use this. I know a lot of R2-D2 or astromech builders, droid builders will use this product. I've used it as well too. Again, if it's a particular look that I'm going for, I will use this. It's just kind of another tool to use in your arsenal. The last couple products I'll showcase are just good old water-based acrylic paints. So I use Liquitex paints a lot. And again, they're water-based. You just use water to clean them off or thin them. I'm going to be doing some dry brushing techniques. So I have an old paintbrush here that's all kind of chewed up. I especially like older ones because they don't leave a really, really clean edge. And I'm going to be kind of mixing between some Liquitex and some Faskolor paints. So these are just some old paints that I had kicking around from RC car racing days, but they're really good. I actually quite like these because they're already pre-thinned, and they tend to be fairly durable as well too, and they're still water-based. Brushes, I'll usually a couple different sizes. This is just a wider one, and this is a slightly narrower one. But again, they're both kind of grubby and beat up. They just add a little bit more texture and detail. For weathering, doing kind of dry brushing or sponge techniques, I'll use this kind of organic sponge. You can get them from just about any arts and crafts store. It's an old sea sponge. And sometimes I'll use just a piece of old foam. Now the issue is when you're using old pieces of foam like this is, again, they're very, very uniform. Everything's very, very straight. A organic sea sponge will give you a little bit more of an organic feel when you're dry brushing and mushing paint around. So just a couple tips there. I forgot to talk about colors. I generally use kind of darker colors. I won't use silver right away. For kind of grubbying things up, I'll use Liquitex iridescent bronze and a iridescent silver steel. They're not quite as bright as the silver, which is more of a highlight color. So I'll kind of use these in the recess areas to make it a little bit more look more grubby, and I'll use kind of silver and some spray later for the highlights. For the scope itself, this is an M38 tank scope. That's what they used in the films, and the original color on them for the bodies was brass. So and then they were sort of painted or coated with black. So to simulate that it was brass underneath, I'm going to be doing some dry brushing and some sponge techniques to make it look like it was brass. So I'm going to be using some gold water-based paint and some bronze, and I'll be mixing some up here on the table and making a mess, but hopefully you'll see how that works. Okay.
So I'm starting off here by just mixing a little bit of silver and a little bit of steel, kind of a gunmetal-y color. I don't want to use pure bright silver at this point. I want to go a bit grungier with this particular blaster. And I'm not trying to replicate 100% accurate sterling. I'm trying to make it a little bit more of like a sci-fi weapon, so I don't mind if it's a little bit grungier and a little bit rougher around the edges. That's okay. It's kind of meant to be seen a little bit more from the distance. So for this particular build, it's more for kind of trooping use and not so much like really up close collector display, so that's okay. I'm mixing up a little bit of bronze now for the scope, and what I'm doing is I'm just doing a traditional dry brush technique, mixing a bit of paint and then removing most of it with a paper towel, and then I'm just hitting the edges, the highlights and the high spots of the scope to make it look like the paint's worn off and that the brass is showing through. And you can see that I'm doing it particular spots on the scope, just spots where I think they might sit a little bit higher and it might rub off a little bit more. I also just painted in the inside of the Faskolor counter and those two cylinders that go on the magazine. And there's a couple other parts that are on the blaster that were originally had a brass finish as well too. So it's completely up to you what you want to paint and where you want to paint it. In this particular case, I'm just doing a bit of that bronze color in a few spots. You can see now, instead of doing dry brushing strokes around the scope to simulate kind of machining, I'm doing more dabbing sort of spots, like make it look like it's been chipped or tarnished off. So now I've switched to the silver, and I'm doing a little bit more of the dabbing technique to make it look like the paint finish is chipped rather than long dry brush strokes. And again, trying to focus on areas that where the blaster is going to be hit or dropped on the ground or knocked up against something. So all the kind of sharp corners, parts that kind of stick out a little bit more that be exposed, just kind of think about if you were handling this thing for years, where would it get worn out? You notice I did do a little bit of silver on the T-tracks, and I know from an authenticity and screen accurate standpoint, the original T-tracks along the side of the barrel were just plastic or rubber, and they probably wouldn't have that silver finish on it. But again, I'm trying to make more of like a sci-fi prop, and from a distance, I kind of want to make those parts stand out a little bit more. So I'm just dry brushing parts like the magazine and all the little mechanisms there where that pop the magazine out, and just working my way around the blaster. Again, thinking about areas that would be exposed more to wear and tear. So I'm highlighting some of the bolts and other little gizmos along that mag release there, because that's where it would be handled a little bit more. Doing the corners of the Faskolor counter now. Again, a little bit more of a dabby technique with a brush rather than big long strokes. Doing a little bit on the scope rail and the rear sight. There's lots of nice machine detail on this particular resin blaster, and so you don't really need to highlight that many areas. You can just do it very lightly, and the detail will show up. And so I find a lot of times people tend to do too much weathering, or in this case, kind of too much highlighting, too many chips, and it just ends up being 40% silver or something, which is way too much. So you just want to think about areas that are going to get roughened up, which are just kind of the outer edges. Again, I know that the grip would be plastic, but I just did a little bit of dry brush on it to kind of bring out the diamond pattern on the grip. Now I'm moving on to the rear slot area where the spring is, and the stock clip where it folds back and gets held into place. Just do a little bit more around the end cap, because I feel like that might be a part that gets twisted open for servicing and that kind of thing. And just kind of going over the whole blaster again, making sure there aren't any parts that I've missed. Doing a little bit more on the stock, and the D-ring on the back. I find that's a really pronounced part, and sometimes if people don't put highlights on it, it doesn't really look worn. I realized I forgot to paint part of the bolt here, so I'm kind of touching that up with a little bit of that silvery gunmetal color. And I'm not being too accurate. I'm trying to paint every single nook and cranny. It's like just trying to hit the highlight parts, because later I'm going to go back in with a little bit of black to dirty it up and make it look a little bit more settled. So now that I let the darker gunmetal color dry, I'm just painting that upper surface area with a little bit of a lighter silver to provide a bit of contrast. So the part that kind of sticks up a little bit more, just a little bit of a brighter silver on it. And that time you can see I'm dragging the brush a little bit more laterally to simulate that bolt sliding in back and forth, to showcase a bit of the wear and tear. So now I'm mixing up a little bit more a black color, and what I'm doing is I'm sort of adding a bit of dirt and grunge in the recesses. There might have been areas where I applied a little bit too much of the highlight brass color or the silver color, or I want to make it seem like there's more of a dirt or grunge or grease buildup on it. So I'm kind of hitting all these more recessed areas to make a little bit more kind of lived in and worn. I like my stuff a bit more grungy. I'm not trying to make it a perfect up close display prop. I like stuff a little bit more worn and battle scarred and battle damaged. I think here I'm mixing up a bit of brown and black. I think it's a burnt umber and black, maybe like 50-50, to get this kind of warm black look. And I'm doing this spring just to add a bit of grunge to it, so that the issue is that when you look down that gap, it's just this perfectly clean, shiny spring. So I'm just kind of grunging it up a little bit, and then we're going to put it back inside. So yeah, this part's pretty straightforward. This coil too, I forgot to mention, you can use anything. You can use like a coat hanger or some other sort of thicker gauge wire. This aluminum wire that I had on hand, it was just something that I had left over from sculpting work, and it happened to be the right size, wrapped around that 1/2-inch dowel. So, but the actual spring is a bit thinner diameter than that in terms of the thickness of the wire, and also the opening in the receiver itself is much bigger on the actual prop, but we're kind of making do with the best that we've got. So just adding a little bit more grunge to the inside of that bolt. I'm focusing on the more recessed areas, and a little bit more of a dabbing technique, and I'm not that worried about making it perfectly clean. You can see I'm just getting pretty messy in there, and I'm just using an old rag to kind of wipe off areas that I want to be a little bit more clean. But I wanted this to be a bit grungier. So moving on to that back end of the bolt area, same thing, painting those recessed areas. And that's about it. This only took about just under 30 minutes for the whole thing. Here I'm just using some silver lacquer paint on a rag to hit some high spots on there to get some more opaque silver on the blaster, and that's about it.